Alright, so this was Exam 5, Part 3 review. Okay, it's not really a whole lot to it, honestly. It's only like about a lecture and a half. Plus, I give like tips about the TBL thing. I didn't really want to spend like forever on it because it's basically just one form that I use to study, and I put the link to it below, at least to like the main Google Drive where that's at. So it's me and Stacy's like study materials that are like coordinated together. So what you would do is you go in that file, folder or whatever, and then under that folder you go into another one. I think it's like exam, like it says like what the names of all the different exams are, and what block it is. So you go through that one, and then it may be like under like review materials or some other folder. But I think as soon as you click that one, you go to MFM, and then it's like in that folder. So, and I put the actual name of the document so there's no confusion as to which one it is. But yeah, it's made by this guy. Is Michael Ray. It's this guy like a lot of people use as study guides and stuff. I use the study guides, so I'm just as guilty as everyone else is. But yeah, he made a couple of like really good MFM ones. This is one of those. So it's just really nice to just be able to use something that's kind of tried and true. So I would recommend using that because he does seem to he like breaks it down by objective, so it's like really nice. And it kind of hits the high points, so it's really good. But yeah, so that's just a heads up for later. But anyway, so I have these slides in the part two review that I made back a while ago, but like I don't have I don't have the so I didn't ever cover it though. So like they were in there, but I never covered it. So that's why we're going to be going over just a little bit about like vitamin D and things like that because I didn't actually cover it with that last session, like I'm saying. But it is in part two. If you want to like for some reason delete those or whatever you want to do with them, it doesn't really matter because it's all the same slides. I didn't change those at all. The ones I did change are the ones that I added to this one. So that's pretty much it. But yeah. So anyway, so the first let me move this chat thing. Okay. So very first thing you need to know about it, right, is like where does it come from? Like how is vitamin D made? Right? Well, cholesterol is the main precursor for vitamin D. And it kind of makes sense if you know like kind of what cholesterol, if you know what vitamin D sort of looks like. It's got like all these rings just like cholesterol does. So it kind of makes sense that it comes from cholesterol. But anyway, what you need to know from this is you need to know basically this whole slide as far as like what form comes from where, and like where does it transport to. That's very important. Like, for instance, I have in red here that 7-dehydrocholesterol that forms in the liver, so know where it forms, right? And then it transported to the skin. So that's where you get, like when UV exposure, like UV light happens there, it converts that to cholecalciferol. So it converts this 7-dehydrocholesterol with UV light at the skin, right? Because it gets transported to the skin into cholecalciferol or vitamin D3. Um, Now, however, it's not really done um, all of the way, right? So it's not like an active form of vitamin D just yet. And so what it has to do is it has to basically be hydroxylated in the liver. So it has to be basically it goes from the liver to the skin, and that UV light converts it to cholecalciferol, right? And then cholecalciferol then goes back to the liver, and that forms what we call 25 hydroxycholecalciferol. Now that is like still inactive, so it doesn't really ever become fully active until it goes to the kidney, where it interacts with this 1-alpha hydroxylase. So always remember like key enzymes and like in these pathways because they're always like high yield to ask about because they like to ask those. That way they make sure you know the entire pathway. Of course, there's no way for me to really know exactly which one they'll ask about, but it's just nice to know all of it just in case. But anyway, so that 1-alpha hydroxylase, right? It's going to hydroxylate that carbon one of that whole chain, right, to form calcitriol. Now, calcitriol is the actual active form. The act in the other like name for it would be 125 OH2 D3 or this whole thing right here. So these two are the same thing. Like so, this is one name for it, and this is like the shorter version. This other bit right here. But calcitriol is what we call it, and it's going to be your bio. I can't even say it. Biologically, yeah, form of vitamin D. Okay, so like I said, know the whole pathway, know kind of what gets transported where, know where 1 alpha hydroxylase is, and how calcitriol is essentially formed in the kidney. That's pretty much what you need to take away from here. All right. Now on to just a little intro slide, basically about like what these do. I included it just because I thought it was like a nice little summary. PTH, that's your parathyroid hormone. So that actually promotes mobilization of calcium. Now, what that actually means for the most part is it's going to be breaking down bone in order to get the calcium from your bones. So it's going to be doing like resorption, is what that process is called. Okay. Calcitriol. Calcitriol basically, so vitamin D is like the easier way for me to think about it because they tend to refer to it as vitamin D outside of this class. But anyway, so calcitriol improves mineralization. So the difference between it and PTH is like it's going to get vitamin D as well, right? Because it is vitamin D. So it's going to be getting calcium with it, right? But it's also going to be getting phosphate. So that's the difference between it and PTH. Is that PTH actually tries to get rid of phosphate, while calcitriol is going to be getting phosphate. So there is like a little bit of difference between the two. And I don't know if she really highlights it all that well, but if she does, I'll be sure to note that. Calcitonin. Okay, so calcitonin does basically the exact opposite of PTH. So it's going to be doing increasing deposition of calcium, which means basically just making bone or storing calcium right within bone. Okay, so calcitriol, like what exactly does it do, right? Like how does it do its action, essentially? So calcitriol, what it does is, like I said, it stimulates that calcium absorption. Now, where does it do that? Specifically in the intestines, where it does that. And it is important to know where it does that because it has different like jobs depending on where vitamin D is located. Okay, so I don't, like I said, I don't really know if she goes much into phosphate, but if she does, you definitely need to know where they come from. But anyway, so like I said, this one, right? It talks about the intestine first. Okay, so stimulates calcium absorption from the intestine, and it does this by increasing a particular proteins called calbindin. Okay, now what calbindin does says it right here, right? It increases that calcium absorption from the intestine specifically, right? And that stimulates ATP-dependent calcium pump. So basically, it's like some kind of calcium ATPase, essentially, right? Because it's ATP dependent. Okay, which then transports that calcium into the blood. So it kind of like have that one transporter on the luminal side of the intestine, right, which will be taking in that calcium, and then you'd have another transporter on the outside, so going toward the bloodstream, right, and that basically just allows it to be transported to the bloodstream, essentially, right? But yeah, that's what calbindin does specifically. And so, how does vitamin D, right, kind of fit into this? Well, it increases that concentration of calbindin, right? And since calbindin interacts with that calcium absorption aspect or calcium pump, right, it allows more calcium into the blood. So that's kind of like the way I like to think about it. Okay. Then kidney reabsorption. So this is like a different little process. It's kind of similar though. So she doesn't really go into details about it being phosphate related or not. So at least on this lab. So kidney does the same thing. So it's going to be instead of absorbing it from the diet, right? In this case, it's going to be reabsorbing it from basically like your renal system trying to get rid of it. So it's like reabsorbing it instead of actually absorbing it the first time. But yeah, net effect, right? We've already talked about it. Basically, just elevates blood calcium for maintenance of bone mineralization or density, right? So that's pretty much what it does. Okay, PTH, right? PTH is secreted by parathyroid glands, right? Makes sense with what it's called, right? In response to low calcium levels or increased serum phosphate. So remember how I said earlier about it having to do with calcium and phosphate, right? And how it wants to build up levels of calcium but decrease levels of phosphate. So, with that in mind, it makes sense that it's secreted in response to low calcium levels, right? Because it wants to basically build up calcium, right? And then it also makes sense if it's responding to increased serum phosphate because it's wanting to get rid of phosphate, right? So it totally makes sense. Now, why exactly does it want to get rid of phosphate? Well, this little red statement here is why. Because that phosphate, I'm sure you've heard of calcium phosphate, right, before. It's able to basically bind to one another. And active calcium is free calcium. So it's not active calcium if it's bound to phosphate. So that's what she means when she refers to that every now and then about it being free calcium or active calcium. You need it not bound to phosphate. So PTH is basically that enzyme, that hormone that tries to make it not do that, essentially. Um, but anyway, so PTH, right, kind of goes on details about like how exactly it gets it from bone. So it does this by activating osteoclasts, right, which is going to be basically taking calcium from bone by breaking it down, essentially, right. As soon as that calcium level drops too low, it's going to be doing that process. Okay. Okay. Let's see what this question is. When they mean low, high calcium and phosphate, do they refer to the concentrations in the blood or in the bone? They mean in the blood. Yeah. So it's levels in blood. Yeah. Yeah. No problem. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of confusing. I don't know if they ever actually like mentioned that or not, but yeah, it's definitely in the blood for sure. All right. Calcitonin. Okay. So calcitonin. Where does it come from? Always important to know where all these come from and what they do. Right. So it comes from these parafollicular C cells of the thyroid gland. Now it's kind of really similar, in location, but of course it's a separate gland, but really, really close to one another, as you guys probably know by now. And histo, right? That thyroid, parathyroid, they're really close to one another. But calcitonin comes from the thyroid, but these particular cells within the thyroid, right? And this PTH, it comes from the parathyroid glands, right? Makes sense with its name, makes it really easy and simple to remember where it comes from. So, like I said, it does the opposite of what PTH typically does. So it's going to be decreasing this calcium levels instead, right? So it'd respond to high levels of calcium, right? Because it's trying to decrease the level. But, yeah. So calcitriol and PTH directly or indirectly promote processes that raise blood calcium. So basically, like I said, they kind of worked against one another, and so that process of them working against one another is kind of what maintains that calcium level within the blood, right? Calcitriol, right? It's going to be increasing, like we've already said, in the intestines and the kidneys by inducing those transporters, those calcium ATPases that we were just talking about, right? So that's how it does that. So it absorbs it in the intestines from the diet, and it reabsorbs it from basically urine, right, in the kidneys. So that's how it gets that calcium. Now, PTH is going to be supporting the same process that calcitriol does. Okay, so it does support what vitamin D does. So that's a little thing to keep in mind because she may ask a question about like the relationship between the two, but I'm kind of doubting it. But it is kind of nice to remember that. PTH also promotes absorption of calcium in the kidneys. So it does, like I said, similar in process to vitamin D. So notice it promotes absorption of calcium in the kidney, just like calcitriol or vitamin D does. Um, but the difference here is right between PTH and vitamin D. If you remember, vitamin D is only going to be doing basically absorption or reabsorption of calcium. It's not going to be typically breaking down bone at all, right? PTH is going to be breaking down bone to get calcium. So that's the difference between the two. Okay, so typically you don't want PTH to be at high levels because of that, right? Because that can lead to just too much bone being broken down over time. So definitely not a good thing to have high. And then calcitonin, on the other hand, like I said, it's going to be doing the opposite of that, of all this process of calcium transport, right? Because it's wanting to get rid of excess calcium. So how is it going to typically do that? Is it going to be storing it in bone. So the way your bones develop, right, is you're going to typically be breaking them down over time and rebuilding them back up. And that kind of like, creates better strength over time. And so it's a normal process for this to occur over time anyway, but there are like certain disease processes that can occur, and we'll talk about them here in a second. All right, rickets is one of those processes, right? So rickets, or rickets in children, so they're the same thing. Rickets or osteomalacia. So they're the same thing, but they're named different based upon if it's in children or in adults. So basically, just put a rickets slash osteomalacia. Okay, they're the same thing, and that's the way to think about it. Okay, now what this is a vitamin D deficiency. Okay, so if you think about it, right, what did vitamin D do again, right? It absorbs calcium from the intestine, or it reabsorbs calcium from the kidney. Now, in this case, right, with a deficiency, it's going to be typically doing mainly the reduction in intestinal absorption more than anything else. So it's going to be mainly targeting this intestinal calcium absorption. So, yeah. Does calcitonin release serum phosphate? No, it doesn't. Um, because I guess in a way it'd actually be doing the opposite of that. So it'd actually be probably putting more phosphate back in, if I had to guess, like into bone, because you do need phosphate in order to make bone. So that's why vitamin D is kind of important because it actually allows for phosphate to be brought back into the system. So calcitonin really all it does, it doesn't really have much to do with phosphate except maybe I don't think it really regulates that as far as like bone, um, like creating bone. It doesn't really do much with phosphate, but it's going to be doing more with calcium. So it's basically going to be, if the calcium levels are high, it's going to be storing it within bone. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, cool. All right. So this whole slide kind of, like I said, basically kind of sums up what the disease process of this is, like why it's a problem. But yeah, so basically, you have no vitamin D or very, very low vitamin D, right? That causes this. It's going to be reducing the intestinal calcium absorption, so it's going to be causing problems with basically building bone, right? Because, like I said, you need calcium, especially for building bone. Okay, so you're going to have that reduced plasma calcium, right? Which is going to, if you think about it, right, raise PTH because PTH, if you remember, goes either up when there's not enough calcium or goes up when there's too much phosphate. So that's what PTH does. Okay, so in this case, since you're not able to absorb calcium because your vitamin D is low, your PTH is going to go up because it's like, oh, I need some calcium, right? And so what that will do over time, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, PTH, how it gets calcium, is going to be breaking down bones. Okay, so since you're not able to build up bone and basically only break down bone most of the time, over time it's going to be leading to basically brittle bones or bones that bend very easily in children specifically. So that's where it gets like the disease process from, is mainly because of that PTH slash not enough vitamin D kind of thing. But the main thing to remember about it is that it's a vitamin D deficiency. Okay. And like what it looks like and kind of what the mechanism of PTH would be, but like behind the scenes, essentially. So it sums it up pretty well in here. But yeah, if you ever have any questions about it, just let me know. When osteoblasts are unable to form, hydroxyapatite. That's how I say it. I don't know if that's the right way to say it. But anyway, so it basically just sums up kind of what I said. So osteoblasts are as you guys probably remember, osteoblasts are going to be the ones that build up bone instead of breaking down bone. So since they're not able to form hydroxyapatite, which is made up of calcium and phosphate, but in this case with rickets, you don't have enough calcium, right? And so that will result in osteomalacia or rickets because you don't have that calcium. Right? Um, But yeah, normal collagen matrix, right? But it's not enough mineralization because of that hydroxyapatite is not able to be formed, and therefore you won't be able to have that strong bone. You'll just only be able to have collagen, which is going to be, of course, making it either very brittle or very bendy in the case of children, right? So, common causes of vitamin D deficiency. These may help with like a stem of a question or something like that, but I don't see her directly ask. I mean, she may directly ask like a first order question based on that, but I just feel like she wouldn't. Um, but yeah, I feel like something like this would be in like the question stem, especially like sun exposure. I mean, you automatically kind of think of that a lot of the time, or in the diet. That's probably like most common of the most common here. Of course, here's the other things that cause that. And then, so lab results, they would show like low calcium levels, of course, right? Because they're not able to absorb it because of that low vitamin D. Okay. So what is the actual treatment of that? You don't really have to know. Probably, well, I mean, treatment's super simple anyway, so you wouldn't have to like sit there and really think hard to memorize it. Anyway, it's going to be replacing calcium and vitamin D. Totally makes sense because you want to be building that bone back up to its original strength, essentially, right? So that's why it's that treatment. The reason PTH, just a reminder, why that's high is because right the calcium level's low, and the only thing your body knows what to do if the calcium level's low is raise PTH. Right now with this alkaline phosphatase, that's part of like the osteoclast type mechanism. So they use alkaline phosphatase, right? And if your PTH is high, your alkaline phosphatase is going to be high because it's going to be activating this osteoclast to break down bone to get that calcium that you don't have. So that's why it's high as well. If you just want to know from FYI. All right. Now, osteoporosis. Now this is like a totally different like disease. So kind of put that one out of your mind for now. Move on to osteoporosis. Okay. So what is that? Right. It's when bone resorption, so the basically bone breakdown, outweighs bone formation. So in that case, right, your PTH mechanism, that kind of mechanism, your osteoclast would be overly active. Okay. Versus your bone formation, right, or your calcitonin type reactions, right, where you build up bone, is going to be a lot less. So that's the difference. Now, what causes these? Like, what can actually cause osteoporosis? A lot of the time, yeah, you hear like decreased estrogen, so that's why like elderly women tend to have problems with osteoporosis a lot of the times because over time, right, their estrogen levels like tend to decrease over time. So that's why it's like as they get older, as women tend to get older, they tend to have problems with osteoporosis. So that's one of the reasons as to how you can get osteoporosis to develop. Of course, decreased vitamin D, that makes sense as well, right? Decreased calcium, that kind of goes back with, if you think about it, kind of like osteomalacia anyway. But just don't let that confuse you, of course. Treatment's not really important here, but I mean, she does have it in blue, so I mean, I don't know. It's only like one little factoid to remember, so it's not too bad. But yeah, I put a star here because it's a disease, of course. All right, so then on to the very last slide of this thing. The reason I have this here is just to really give you a reminder that only free ionized calcium is considered bioactive. Now, I think it may have been like a first order type question on ours. May have used like some kind of weird lab work or something to be like what percentage is like actually active or something weird like that. But I would definitely memorize, like remember that only free ionized calcium is bioactive. Because you remember it goes back to that whole PTH thing as to like why you don't want too much phosphate with too much calcium because they're just going to bind to one another and not be active calcium. That's what I mean by this. So only free ionized calcium is considered bioactive. Now, a lot of the time, so most of it tends to be bound to, well, at least a good chunk of it tends to be bound to this in this protein bound form with albumin. So that's also good to remember that it can also bound with albumin, and that's like a really good like transportation for calcium. So I would also remember that fact as well. But for the most part, definitely know that free ionized calcium is the bioactive considered calcium. So then on to this other one, so nutrition and metabolism. Okay. I took out the objectives because I don't know they're kind of like odd. She's got like these grayed out ones that I feel like were probably just like, oh, that's just FYI, you don't need to know it. But for the most part, I don't know if I can take them out and kind of decrease slide numbers. It's kind of nice to do. All right. So anyway, I left this in here just to kind of give you an idea of like how they do the namings for these different types of fat. Okay. So anyway, number of double bonds is one of the ways they can use it to like actually name them. So that's where you get like 18 comma 5, for instance, right? That would be like two double bonds because that's how many numbers are listed there. Location of double bonds, that would be what the numbers are. So that's where you get this omega 3, omega 6 because they have a double bond. All the omega 3s have a double bond at the third position. While this 6 here, right, means that it's at position 6 instead of position 3. So that's the difference in structure directly with that. Also, cis versus trans configuration. That's where you get like things like trans fats or just regular saturated fats, because trans fats, right? They're gonna have like a trans configuration at a certain double bond. Okay, so that's where you get like the difference between those. Okay, so I put like stars on most of these because it's very important to know. She's really big about you knowing the diets as far as like where these types of fats come from. I think we may have had at least one or two questions on it. So that's why I have it all in red, have all these stars slide for you guys, because I know she does like to ask that sort of thing. Um, but anyway, so also I thought was important is the stuff I have underlined here. Um, but anyway, just to kind of, if you're not a Tory learner, I'll just go ahead and say it. Saturated fatty acids, they're found within like dairy products, of course, so like things like cheese, like milk, right? Then you have like meat products and also some vegetables, specifically coconut oil and palm oil. She may mention one of those because they're like a specific kind of oil. She wouldn't just say vegetable oil. She might say coconut or palm oil if there is one of those first order questions, like I was saying. But anyway, the main importance of these saturated fatty acids, like what is it, like what exactly does it do to your cholesterol, right? It will increase LDL cholesterol, otherwise known as like typically the bad level of cholesterol. But of course, you do actually need some LDL. So it's not like you want it to be super duper low, right? But you don't want it high. It's one of those things. Okay. They do this by increasing formation of LDL and by decreasing LDL turnover. So basically, they increase the amount of LDL by making more of it, right? And they decrease the amount of LDL by basically breaking it down. Well, actually, wait a minute. No, never mind. They increase LDL by one of the two ways, right? Either by making more or by decreasing the breakdown of LDL. That's what I meant. So don't get yourself confused. Okay. Lower carbon length. I don't think that's all that important. Yeah. The things that are important here, what's in red, what's underlined. So that last one's more like an FYI type thing. So mono unsaturated fatty acids. So the difference between like a mono unsaturated and like a polysaturated or just regular saturated is that a mono. Well, wait a minute. This is mono unsaturated. Never mind. Don't pay attention to me. So I thought I said monosaturated, not mono unsaturated. So don't even worry about that thing I was gonna bring up. It's not a big deal. Okay. Anyway, mono unsaturated fatty acids. Where are they found? Right, it's going to be vegetables or olive oil specifically. So, like I said, notice she mentioned specific kinds of oils and not just vegetable oil. Okay, and fish. Okay, so no fish and olive oil for monounsaturated fatty acids. Okay, so what does that kind of include? Right, it's going to be like oleic acid. I know Dr. Kick, or I think she had maybe another lecture. Somebody had a lecture on like the different types of acids back, like I think in that part two I made. So you can kind of see that chart that kind of breaks it down a little bit better for you, in my opinion, to kind of like learn that again. Um, but what does this actually do, right? They tend to actually lower LDL cholesterol by increasing hepatic LDL receptor number and turnover. So in this case, right, it's actually increasing LDL being able to be back reabsorbed into the liver, and also by breaking it down more. So monounsaturated, with that in mind, right, monounsaturated is going to be better for you than saturated, right? Because it's getting rid of that LDL, therefore not making it too high. So monounsaturated, much better than saturated. All right, now polyunsaturated is even better than monounsaturated, right? Because it has like direct health benefits. Yeah. So different types of them, right? So there's omega 6 and there's omega 3. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right, what that means essentially is like where that double bond is located. Okay. So notice here, right, with omega 3s, it's located at these three positions, like where the first one's at, right? And then omega 6, it's where the first one's located, right here at this 6. Okay. So once again, I have it in red here, like where they come from, these omega 6s, right? So they come from nuts, avocado, cotton seeds, or corn oil. Okay, so that's where they come from. All right. Then you have linoleic, and I would remember the names of these acids that go along with omega 6. That just makes your life kind of easier, so you don't get yourself confused. Now, as far as like EPA and DHA, they're never going to refer to them as eco whatever that is. or docosahexaene, whatever. They're never going to refer to that as that. They're going to always refer to them as EPA and DHA. Okay, so from what I remember, I don't think they ever mentioned the long name for those. But anyway, so why I have this one underlined and this one underlined is to basically keep myself from being confused. Because if you notice, right, the only difference in naming between the two is that this one has an alpha in front of it, and like a little N, which I'm not even sure if that's supposed to be there. So it seems like it might not be supposed to be there, but either way, that's why I underlined them so there wouldn't be any confusion. Linoleic and arachidonic, okay, they're omega 6. These three are omega 3. Okay, that's why it's important to know, like I said, once again, what foods they come from and which type are omega 3 and which type are omega 6. Okay, so there are three types of omega 3. So we just covered that just a second ago. A lot of this is going to be a lot of kind of FYI type information here. I didn't really read this per se, but it is kind of important to know those too. So I'd probably read that on your copy. I don't know why I didn't, because it's kind of lists foods, right, where those come from. Um, Now, I put this in red because I thought it was just important to kind of know. Not that I don't know if it necessarily will show up on the test or exam, but it is important to kind of know. EPA, DHA, they're going to basically help your heart out a lot. So it's going to help heart rhythm, lowering HR, your heart rate, and preventing arrhythmias. So basically, just like missteps in beating, right, or pattern. Okay. Then you have omega polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is what PUFA stands for. So omega 3 versus omega 6. Okay. So omega 3s are typically going to be known as your good ones. Okay. For the most part, right? Now omega 6 is going to have. Now you do still need omega 6. So it's one of those kind of situations where you don't want too much of it, but it's still good to have. So omega 3s typically going to be much better for you than omega 6s are. Okay. And why? Because of that whole decreased heart disease risk by decreasing all this stuff, right? Decreasing platelet aggregation, inflammation, and arrhythmia, which we basically just kind of said with EPA and DHA back here. Okay. Now, what it also can do, it also increases endothelial relaxation. Point of the matter is that omega 3s are really, really good for you. Omega 6s are still somewhat good for you, but you don't want too much of them. Okay. And the reason why is because of this fact right here, right? Arachidonic acid is a precursor for thromboxane A2, which is going to be doing definitely not decreasing platelet aggregation, but instead increasing platelet aggregations. And so therefore it's known as a pro-aggregating agent. So therefore, not very good to have a lot of thromboxane A2, because of course it can lead to a risk of sudden cardiac death in people that have MI and stuff like that. But what this point is actually saying is that a diet rich in omega 3 will actually prevent, well, somewhat prevent, of course, those types of disease or disorders happening, right? So omega 3 is much better for you than omega 6. Once again, kind of put that here. Just that's probably more of an FYI type statement. I thought it was just important, so I put 2 stars here because of that whole arachidonic acid thing. Also because it's more like a heart health type thing, so I thought it was super important, so I just left it there for you like that. So trans fatty acids, okay. So you know how I mentioned earlier that they have it's like a difference in structure as far as like how the double bond is kind of configured. So you have this trans version versus like cis version, which is going to be all the other fatty acids we've already talked about. So that's like the difference in structure. But they're always bad for you, so you never want trans fat. So that's the difference between saturated and trans fat as far as like which one you want. You still kind of need saturated fat in a way, right? But trans fat, no, you definitely never need. It's one of those that they've actually kind of gotten rid of out of most things. It's really hard to find a lot of trans fatty acid type foods in America because they've kind of like decreased. They tried their best to decrease things that have trans fatty acids in them, so that you can still find it, but it's hard to find. All right, and why? Because why are they bad? They elevate LDL and increase the risk of CHD, which is basically cardiac disease, right? But the interesting thing about trans fat is that it also lowers HDL. Now, if you remember from the lipoprotein lecture, right? HDL is good cholesterol, right? Because what it does is it gathers up cholesterol from other tissues, right? And so therefore it decreases your chances of having those cardiac issues, specifically like atherosclerosis or something like that, right? So you definitely don't want HDL decreasing, okay? So that's why trans fatty acids is like super not good for you because it does that. Okay. Now, what was also interesting, right, is this whole point down here, right? Clinical studies found that increased trans fat intake not only increased LDL, but it also increases this thing called LPA. So, if you notice, we'll talk just a little bit about that because it is very important to know. That's why I put the 2 stars there because she did have a question about it. And I definitely remembered it because I was like, oh, this seems important, and I got lucky it was on there. Right? LPA, like all the other bad things in this case, is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, or CHD, which it mentions back here with trans fat. Okay? Now, it's structurally identical to LDL. So LDL and LPA, very, very similar, okay, in structure, right? But the difference is like this thing down here, okay? It's with this ApoA thing. So it's nearly identical. It's a key word there, right? Because it has this additional ApoA particle attached to it. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's covalently attached to ApoB100. That's not the important part. It's important that LPA associated with that increased risk, really close to LDL in structure, and it has that additional ApoA particle because that's like the source of why it's bad. So definitely important to know ApoA with LPA. But anyway, trans fatty acids. It's also 100% important to know trans fatty acids will increase this LPA within circulation. So what is ApoA like? Why is that bad? Right? Well, it's a homolog to plasminogen. Right? Now, if you remember right, plasminogen is a precursor of that blood protease, which targets fibrin. Right? So what does that lead to? Right? Not very good things at all. Right? Because it will cleave fibrinogen, right, to make that fibrin. Not very, very good thing you want to have. Okay. So basically, just know the mechanism behind it. Um, that LPA is going to be increased with trans fatty acids, and then it's a homolog to plasminogen. Okay. So that's what you need to know. And like, what does that mean? That it's that it's very similar, like that it's a precursor to plasminogen. Like, what does that mean in terms of consequences, right? So know that, and that'll help you out, go a long way. All right. So why LDL cholesterol is bad cholesterol, right? Well, basically, kind of already went over all this, but I thought it was a good reminder of like what HDL does. That's why I included it. I also included this one because I don't remember if she asked anything specifically from this. I feel like it's too detailed, honestly, and she knows good and well that you're going to get a lot of information about atherosclerosis. So I just feel like she wouldn't ask anything about it, but once again, this is kind of like erring on the side of precaution, so that's why I decided to include it in there just in case. I remembered it all, but I don't remember her asking anything about it, but just in case, here it is. And I won't go through it because it's like super, super long, and honestly, it sums up pretty well. But once again, it's one of those things. If you have any questions about it, make sure you let me know. I'll put my number in the chat as always, and of course, Facebook friend me or whatever. Email me. Honestly, it really doesn't matter. They're all on my phone. Okay, so I thought this one was a little bit more important because it talks like specific parts of atherosclerosis. Like, I think she may have asked maybe something about like foam cells or something like that, right? So foam cells basically is like they're made by macrophages, like engulfing like lipids. So that's what foam cells essentially are. It's just macrophages full of lipids. Okay. And what they'll end up doing, right, they'll kind of like come together and form these plaques, or these fat plaques, essentially. And so with these plaques, right, you can basically lead to either just like straight up stenosis of the vessel, right? So just like continually accumulate, maybe get like a thrombus on there or some kind of clot, right? Kind of nick that and cause complete stenosis of that vessel, or it could rupture and cause stenosis elsewhere, right, or clots elsewhere. So not a very good thing at all to have, especially in patients with like hypertension, other risk factors for cardiac events, of course. But yeah, that was important about the foam cells, so that's why I included it. Dietary cholesterol, right? So this talks a little bit about, um, and the only thing I thought was kind of important, I don't know if she really asked about it or not, or I thought it was like super neat. Sometimes I confuse those, but she did say important to note, but I don't really know. Anyway, so less cholesterol synthesis occurs, so that's a good thing, occurs when the diet actually has an adequate amount of cholesterol. And why is that? Because it actually inhibits HMG-CoA reductase. Now, if you remember, HMG-CoA reductase is the basically the rate-limiting enzyme of cholesterol synthesis. So it's good. It's good not to have too much cholesterol, but at the same time, you want to have a little bit of cholesterol, right? Because it inhibits that whole process of making more cholesterol. Now, if you think about it, right, that totally makes sense because it's like a kind of like a teeter-totter type situation, right? So it's good to have a balance. Essentially. Now, these she kind of goes kind of weird with these, so I included only the ones that I thought she may have asked questions from in terms of like obesity, insulin resistance, and like metabolism, like metabolic syndrome. So I included the ones that I thought she may have asked questions from. So I just tried to pick and choose which ones I thought were more important. So the combination, it was important to know what metabolic syndrome is. I felt like that might have been like a first order question. So just definitely keep in mind like what is part of that. Okay, so it's a combination of obesity, insulin resistance, high TGs or high triglycerol, right? High HDL, and high blood pressure. That's what metabolic syndrome is. Keep that in mind. Just know what it is. Okay. Now, it's going to be typically found in obese individuals, right? Because obesity causes a lot of these problems, right? Mainly because obesity leads to that insulin resistance, right? Which, of course, if you had insulin resistance, you won't be able to basically absorb carbs as well, right? And of course, if you can't absorb carbs as well, it's going to be leading to basically trying to store it as other types of storages, right? So in that case, right, that's why you get like high lipids or dyslipidemia and other things going on like that because of that problem. Okay. But anyway, obesity, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. That's just kind of like a way to kind of remember them together. But yeah, important to know what metabolic syndrome is, and that insulin resistance is kind of like the key to that via obesity. Okay. Causes of insulin resistance, we just talked about obesity. There is like genetic mutation, of course, that can happen. So that's why there's like that genetic component associated sometimes. And then malfunction, of course, can also happen in those signaling molecules. But yeah, so there's like different ways that insulin resistance can occur. But the one we're going to be mainly talking about is like obesity. But anyway, so I thought I'd include this slide just in case people just don't understand what insulin resistance is. Um, it's basically when the cells are unable to respond to insulin or respond to insulin as well. Okay, that's kind of the way I tend to think about it. I don't think about it as like complete stop of insulin being able to respond, like able to be used. It's more of like I was saying, like kind of like a decreased sensitivity is the way I like to think about it. All right. So mechanisms of insulin resistance. The reason I included this slide because it kind of it talks specifically about like what obesity, like how it leads to insulin resistance. That's why I have a star here because I thought it was important to know that obesity causes insulin resistance via having too much free fatty acids, so excessive free fatty acids or FFAs, right? And excess what we call adipokines or TNF alpha in circulation. So I thought this little diagram super simple, sums it up right for you, what she's saying. Right, source of excess FFAs, right? Of course, that comes from either diet or, of course, adipocytes because you're doing like lipolysis or something like that, right? Breaking down fat. That's where you could get a whole bunch of this extra free fatty acids floating around. Is from that. Of course, since it's larger adipocytes in obese individuals, you're going to have more free fatty acid release just because you have more fat in general, right? These visceral fat deposits are going to have that higher rate of lipolysis, and therefore that contributes to elevation of fatty acids much higher. Basically, what I just said, right? All right. So these free fatty acids are also increased by these adipokines, specifically TNF alpha, which is secreted by adipocytes. So TNF alpha, in the case of this mechanism, definitely not a good thing because it's going to be, like I said, increasing that free fatty acid levels. So with that increase in free fatty acid levels, it's going to be basically leading to a problem with insulin resistance, right? It's going to lead to that insulin resistance. All right, so adipokines, just a little bit more about them. Like, how does it do that exactly, right? How do you get more free fatty acids? Well, it's going to be increasing LPL. Now, if you remember right, LPL is one of those that's like, um, it's going to be kind of helping store fat. So it kind of leads to, in a way, it's like an indirect way of increasing blood fatty acids because you're ending up storing more fatty acids. It's one of those things. This thing in gray up here, she graded this because she's not going to ask anything about it. So once again, if it's grayed, you don't really have to know it. But anyway, I would note that TNF alpha, how it increases blood-free fatty acids is by increasing LPL. Okay, so I definitely know that. And this talks a little bit more in detail about that. Not a big deal. TNF alpha activates our SREBP, which, as you remember probably a little bit from kick slides, increases VLDL in the liver. So once again, not really a great thing to have going on because that's going to be like increasing, your amount of fat floating around and being stored and things like that. So typically not a good thing to raise VLDL either. Okay, and so obesity is associated with dyslipidemia and therefore increased risk of cardiovascular disease. I included these specifically because I didn't know if she asked anything of them, but I did note back then that free fatty acids cause insulin resistance. Now this one's in muscle specifically, while this one's in liver specifically. These would be one of those things that like I'd kind of push off toward the end, but I would try to remember them, kind of thing, because I don't really remember her asking specifically about this. But then again, it does mention specific glutes, like GLUTs, right? So, and if you kind of remember anyway, from like earlier on in MFM when we were talking about glute receptors, glute channels or transporters, if you kind of remember where they're at, it makes this like way easier. Because glute 4, right, you're typically going to find that like pretty much at all like other tissues besides like the liver essentially. And you're going to find glute 2, right, specifically at the liver. So that kind of helps you remember some of these mechanisms. But once again, not really sure if they ask anything from it, but I decided to include it because just in case. Metabolic response to obesity over time, right? So that insulin resistance, as you guys kind of know by now, right, about like diabetes, right? Insulin resistance is like the main factor into what we call type 2 diabetes, right? Because that's how you get that result. Now the thing is here is that typically it's just going to be increasing your insulin levels like over and over again. Like you can make insulin in type 2, right? But you can't make insulin in type 1. But with type 2, you have that insulin resistance, right? So what it's going to do is perpetually increase insulin over and over time, like over and over again, more and more and more, right? And to the point to where those beta cells can't even keep up with the workload, right? Now, what will happen is this thing in red down here, right? However, due to that degeneration of those beta cells over time, right, because it's not able to keep up with the workload, the pancreas will not be able to produce enough insulin to compensate for that resistance anymore. And so therefore you'll have that type 2 starts developing. So this is kind of like that insulin resistance doesn't mean that you necessarily have type 2 diabetes, but it will definitely lead to type 2 diabetes over time if it's not controlled or managed, right? Why do I keep hearing that sound? Like, not really sure. I think it's like email maybe. But anyway, so lack of insulin causes increased fatty acid release. And yeah, this kind of goes a little bit more into detail as to like type 1 diabetes. Didn't really include that because it's more of like an obvious kind of thing to me. Like if you don't have like any insulin, you're obviously going to have all these things happen. especially you guys know more. You guys probably honestly know more about like ketoacidosis than I do, maybe even at this point, because of how long it's kind of been, right? Because you go and like right in the nitty gritty details of it, right? So this basically kind of sums up what we've already kind of known from Dr. Kick's stuff, right? Anyway, patients with type 2, right? We've already kind of talked a little bit about it. However, adipose tissue, now this is important to know, this thing in red here. However, adipose tissue will have partial resistance to insulin signaling, so that's where that kind of goes into play, right, with obesity, because you have like more adipose tissue, therefore you're going to be even more resistant to insulin, right? And so therefore you're way more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than just the typical person that's not as big, right? Um, it prevents excess fatty acids released from adipose. So the patients with type 2 diabetes do not burn fatty acids as much as type 1 patients do. So that's another thing to mention once again, right? So this is kind of an interesting fact, right? Prevents excessive fatty acid release from adipose tissue. So basically, you're just making more and more fat. You're not even breaking down any fat as much as a typical person does, or even type 1 diabetes people do. And the reason that, like type 1 doesn't do that is because it doesn't have that insulin resistance whatsoever. It's that you don't make insulin at all. That's the difference between type 1 and type 2. All right, so that actually is basically it as far as that material goes. I tried, like I said, to highlight everything that I remember being super important. All right, but I'll mention just what I have here for you. Okay, so the specific document I have in there, in that folder. So this is that Google Drive I was talking about. It's the one me and Stacy have made that has like MGA and MFM together. So it has like our stuff for that block together. But anyway, you go to that specific block. Once you click this link here, it may take you to the block. I'm not exactly which folder I put the link to, but it'll take you to a folder like that. You'll want to go into the MFM part, right? Then you want to go and find this specific document name, MFM1 ETOH DBL, right? Ethanol, basically. That's where you want to go. Okay. Like I said here, super helpful. Like I didn't really know much like a day or two beforehand, before that TBO. And I used that micro race study guide, and I actually went to a friend of mine's tutoring group at the time. So I went to theirs. They kind of broke it down a little bit. So if I have any notes from that, I'll try to post it there as well. I think I do. I just didn't know like if it was any better than micro race study guide because, like, no joke, that's how much I trust this study guide. But anyway, so I tried to include like a little bit of the topics that I thought were high yield. But anyway, so I put it here for you. Basically, the big thing, and I know they definitely ask about it, is knowing these different pathways for alcohol metabolism, especially MEOS or MEOS. That was definitely a question. Okay, so those are super important. Know like the main pathway and know what's going on if you have too much alcohol to break down. So in the case of MEOS, right, that'd be if you have too much. Know about specific CYP enzymes. You have to know specifically that CYP2E1. You have to know that specifically, that it helps break down alcohol. Okay. Now there's also different forms of ADH. You also should know those because we had a question about that as well. Okay. Now this one this is kind of like I'm not really sure. I thought there was a question about cirrhosis on there. Because there's like a little heading that says cirrhosis and like kind of gives you all that info. Like it sounded sort of familiar, so I'd definitely give that a shot. But like I said, he sums it up really well. It's all summed up in like 3 pages for you guys. And that's like nothing compared to like how long some of these things can get, as you guys know. So it's a very good run through, very good, clean, easy to read. Also know about the different toxicities mentioned within there. So they have like a different toxicities depending on like what kind of toxicity you're talking about. It lists which ones. The reason I'm not talking about like TVL specifically with you guys is because I don't want to like waste your time. I don't want to make it like too long of a session. Because I know like when it gets down to crunch time, like it is for me. I know it's probably for you guys too. You don't want to be sitting here getting tutored to on hours on end, right? Anyway, so that's what I thought of and that I remembered from that TBO specifically are these things here. Now I mentioned just for advice sake, right? It's worth reading it at least a couple times. That's when it'll kind of stick a little bit, but it won't really stick really well until about like a third or fourth run through. That's where I typically have luck. Is when I run through it about 3 or 4 times. Now, as far as like a time, time component, if you don't have the time to run through it like 4 times, totally don't blame you. But since it's only like 3 pages, it's not really too bad, and it's pretty digestible. He writes it pretty well. Um, so that's just advice from me about this TBO coming up. If you guys have any questions about anything, like I said, let me go ahead and type that in there. So here's my phone number as always. You can always text me whatever time. Preferably not like super late, right? That'd be cool. Do you remember was it TBO and ETOH only? Or was it was ETOH only from what I remember. I don't think they really asked anything about the rest of the block. Um, yeah. So once again, if you have any questions, there's my number for you guys. You can always friend me on Facebook, message me there. That's cool. Email me, whatever. Either way, guys, well, I hope you have a great Tuesday night. It's great seeing everybody turn out. It's awesome. If you haven't put your attendance in yet, I would really appreciate it. I'll go ahead and recopy this into the chat for you guys, for the ones still here. I really appreciate it. It's always really nice. That way, they basically make sure that we're not talking to a brick wall, essentially. That's why we have to do it. Um, but yeah. So thank you guys once again for turning up. If you have any questions, reach out to me in whatever way. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.